My name is Jelena Jezdimirovic, and I'm a research associate with PPIC Water Policy Center. I'm really excited to moderate this next panel on providing safe drinking water in California. At this very moment, hundreds of water systems across the state are providing unsafe drinking water. Most of them are small, they're located in rural regions of the state, and rely on groundwater as their primary source of supply. There are many contaminants in groundwater basins across California. Some of them are caused by humans, like nitrate, which comes from manure and fertilizer. Others, like arsenic and uranium, occur naturally. And what's common to all of them is that treatment is incredibly expensive. And that's a huge challenge for small communities which don't have economies of scale to do this. One common example that comes up is of a community called Lanier in Fresno County. Lanier is a very small town. It's been dealing with arsenic in its water supply for a very long time. Finally, in 2007, Fresno County stepped in and built a water treatment plant for this community. Water treatment plant ran for about 6 months and then shut down because the community could no longer afford to run it. So that sort of shows a dual example of the need for capital investments in these communities, but also the need for support for operations and maintenance of small water systems. But in addition to water quality issues, many of these small water systems and households that rely on domestic wells also deal with water shortages. This is especially an issue during droughts in California when groundwater pumping increases and groundwater levels go down and many shallow wells dry out. California has started to make progress on a lot of these issues, and I will kind of highlight the latest example, which is the passing of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, which is now providing water suppliers in the disadvantaged communities with funding for ongoing operations and maintenance. I don't believe any ribbon cutting was involved, Tim, but it was a pretty exciting moment nonetheless. The fund is expected to provide $130 million every year for the next 10 years. So, despite all of these strides, many small water systems are still out of compliance, and we've heard on the first panel how large urban suppliers are dealing with risk and disaster and climate extremes. Think about the smallest of systems and what kind of challenges they will face. There are many small systems in California. In fact, 60% of community water systems serve only 0.6% of California's population. So we have these ongoing management challenges. We have climate change that is expected to make things worse. We started to make some progress, but how do we provide safe drinking water in California? I don't have an answer to that question, but lucky for me and for all of you, we have a great panel today that can help us share some insights. So joining us today, we have to my left Darrin Polhemus, Deputy Director of Division of Drinking Water at State Water Board, Jonathan Nelson, Policy Director for Community Water Center, Jan Coppinger, Administrator of the Lake County Special Districts, and Stephanie Anagnoson, Water Resource Planner for Madera County. And you can find their bios in your program. Thank you all for joining us today. Darrin, I'm going to start with you. You're sort of a veteran of this conference. You were here the very first time we held it. And at the time, all of our conversations were related to kind of how do we get this source of funding for operations and maintenance of the small systems. So now that we have the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund in place, how is State Water Board planning to distribute this funding? Tell us about, the top solutions on your list.
Okay, so thank you. So, if I may, I'd actually like to do a little groundwork here before I answer that question directly. So let's let's do a couple things that, even thinking back to when I was here 3 years ago, some things we know. First, we know that the water utility delivery system for drinking water doesn't work for everybody. It works for the majority of Californians. It works for probably 95 to 97 of them fantastically, but there's this minority group that's left out of that. So what's the deal and what's broken there? Second premise, the water quality that we designed a lot of those systems for doesn't exist anymore. We can cast dispersions as to why that is and whatever there is, but I got to deal with the reality of it. You got to deal with the reality of it. We got to go forward from here. And so the base fundamental of how they thought they would operate into the future is changed under their feet, to be quite literal. Taking those two things, I think we then can understand that when we look at our enforcement statistics, as you mentioned, a lot of small systems, well, literally, if you look at my kind of statistics on systems that fail and aren't achieving water quality standards, 90% of them are under 500 connections. There are systems above that that aren't meeting it as well, but the kind of evidence points to these really small systems struggle to deal with it, and they're kind of backed up against those premises I just mentioned. So, getting into the safe, affordable drinking water, we worked vigorously along with our partners in the community, water community here to get this. This was, I should emphasize, a missing piece. So a lot of people want to think that, oh, something new's happened, and something new did happen, but it's an addition to a lot of program that already existed. We've done billions of dollars already in this state of improving our water delivery infrastructure, both in large and small systems. But what we saw over and over again was a missing piece. So small systems struggle a lot of the times because they just don't have the capacity to actually get the aid that they need. And that's been something that we've worked on vigorously through technical assistance and other things. But I challenge each of you that work at a larger utility to think about, do your job all day long, even into extra hours, and then go home and try to do it again as a volunteer director of some small water system and see how successful you think you would be in applying for all our funding and assistance. So this being the missing piece is built on our existing programs that include both our regulatory structure, our financial structure, and now can kind of plug in to try to take us into a new era on how we can address safe, affordable drinking water. I see it implementing in a couple phases. The first phase, and what we've promised all along, is that kind of addressing one of my premises, is that we need to make the water utility delivery more efficient. That's going to be a big struggle for a lot of people. That means consolidation. That means regional management or managerial consolidation. That means basically changing where they're at. It seems a bit folly to spend good money to prop up what may not be the most efficient way of delivering water. And so we're committed to working through that first phase to make sure that we try to address the efficiency component first. Also, in that very first phase is interim water. There are systems that are in desperate need of interim water, and of course, we'll use a lot of this funding to try to get there with addressing that need for them. Second phase then comes into basically looking at how we do transition them through that construction phase into consolidation. There'll be a lot of capital works need to make that happen. There will be, this is where I kind of put on, I think, where I should have had a degree in sociology at times to try to overcome the tribalism that we face at these small community levels. So we'll need those of you that have a degree in psychology, please help me, or sociology, to come to work for us, because we're going to need that. Because a lot of times the barriers are imagined or perceived, but not real. And then I think kind of in the final phase of this rollout, which will be several years down the road, we're looking at then both looking at how do we develop the workforce in those communities so that they can now take over on these professional level systems with real careers and doing the service that many of you do in this room to delivering safe drinking water as a base utility, so that the dream of people is, right, they pay their bill, they get good quality water, they go on with their lives, and they do other things, and they don't worry about, the water component. It should just be this base function that we stand upon and build our societies from. So that, and then, of course, in the end, we know that there will be some places where we couldn't get efficient enough, and there'll be some need for discussion amongst the public at large, how we subsidize that component going forward, and there'll be more to come on that as we go.
Thank you, Darrin. Jonathan, you're the policy director of the Community Water Center, which was one of the leading environmental justice groups that worked to establish the new Safe Drinking Water Fund. Can you tell us a bit about how the Community Water Center and its partner organizations in the environmental justice community are planning to work on implementation of the fund?
Yeah, and thank you for having us and for everyone for being here. One of the items on the to-do list is to get Darrin more staff so he can get some sleep at night, not have to work every weekend. As I look around the crowd, I just want to say thank you because I recognize many faces that came together around this basic premise that all Californians should have access to safe and affordable drinking water, but that was grounded in the reality that, which still exists right now, that 1 million Californians don't have access to safe drinking water, and that low-income communities of color are disproportionately impacted, and that didn't just happen, but was the result of decades of decisions that were made about where certain communities could live and where investment decisions were made or weren't made. And so, just thank you to those of you that fought so hard for years, over the last 3 years, to get the Drinking Water Fund to the finish line, and also that we wouldn't have been able to achieve that without the leadership of this administration as well as from the Assembly and the Senate. And that, for the communities that we work with in the Central Valley and the Central Coast predominantly, this is a huge moment of celebration because for many of them, they fought not just over the last 3 years as part of this campaign for the Drinking Water Fund, but for decades. Dolores Huerta, one of the champions of that effort, was marching for safe water 50 years ago in the very same communities that still don't have safe water now. So part of how we're planning to move forward is through celebrating the hard work that was done and really helping communities that are impacted that waited for so long to feel their sense of agency and power to actually be able to see change happen in their communities. With that said, I think how the community organizations like Community Water Center, our partner organizations like Leadership Council and Clean Water for Action, how we intend to continue moving forward is to keep doing what we've been doing, which is to continue to work with and alongside communities that are on the front lines of not only the drinking water challenges that we have right now, but that will continue to be on the front lines of the effects of climate change that we're already seeing and will continue to see, and to be organizing them to be able to be a part of solutions and to really empower them to have a meaningful seat at the table and a voice in the conversation. I think for us, what we want to see is to be able to move forward with implementation in a manner that both reflects the urgency of what it means to come home every night and not have safe water flowing from your tap, or to have to check to see if you've got enough bottled water in your home before inviting over family or friends, but to also move forward in a way that stays true to the original vision of the Drinking Water Fund, which was that it was designed to complement existing funding, not replace everything, and that it has very specific purposes. And we want to make sure that those purposes and the vision of the Drinking Water Fund is actually turned into reality for those that need it. And we want to make sure that our most vulnerable populations in this state don't fall through the cracks as we move forward into the implementation of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. And so communities that come to mind for us are, what about our domestic well communities? What about our state small communities? How are we, in a way that's scalable and systemic, going to be able to move solutions out to those populations that have fallen through the cracks over the prior years and decades? And then also, how are we recognizing that the way that we implement policy as a state where we've got, the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund over here, we've got Sigma over here, we've got some other policies over there. How do we recognize that, and the lives of the families in these communities, everything intersects. Everything ties together at the end of the day. And if we're not tying our policy together at the end of the day, that's going to show up in really consequential ways, negative ways for these communities. So how are we thinking about, with the implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, making sure that these draft groundwater sustainability plans that have been coming out, really as we speak, are designed and are going to be implemented in a way that doesn't work at cross purposes or even undercut implementation of the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund, because some of these plans that we're seeing in the Valley that are in draft form right now could have real consequential and negative effects on access to safe and sustainable drinking water in these communities. So how do we tie everything together in a way that reflects the reality on the ground? And I think for the Community Water Center and other environmental justice organizations, we want to continue to really be partners and to work to make this as successful as possible, recognizing that there will be some learning along the way, but we stand committed to do our part, and there's no one more invested in the success of the Drinking Water Fund than those without safe water right now.
Thank you, Jonathan. Jan, Darrin has brought up consolidation as one potential solution to safe drinking water crisis. Lake County has had an interesting experience with consolidation, and it's now considered a success story after a bit of a rocky start. Yours is also a story of small water systems dealing with natural disaster and climate extremes. So can you tell us a bit more about this, and what lessons can you share for the rest of California?
Sure, thank you. The County of Lake has been in a state of emergency for over 8 years. One disaster right after another. It started with a drought, which of course brought on millions of dead trees and bark beetle. Then it's been massive wildfires for the last 4 years. Over 60% of our county has burned. We've lost thousands of homes. Public water systems burned down. And then on top of that, because of the burn scar and the runoff, the floods of 2017 and 2019 were also devastating. And just as a little side note, we put $1.7 million into rebuilding a water system that was burned down in the Valley Fire. The floods of 2019, the runoff from Boggs Mountain took out the roads, the culverts, and the brand new water system. It was one of the most discouraging things I've ever seen. But back in, Lake County started out with all the little subdivisions and developments that were being built for years, put in their own little water system. So there are just hundreds of little tiny water systems being managed there. And the county tried to encourage consolidation in the late 80s and early 1990. They did feasibility studies to see about consolidating some of these little systems. 2 consolidations did take place. One, it was 40 little water systems were all consolidated into one. It's the North Lakeport Water System. It's one of our larger systems that we manage, and one of our strongest systems. It's got the lowest water rates. It's got over $2 million in capital improvement reserves built up. It's a very strong system because of this consolidation. Another one was Soda Bay. It was, I believe, 12 water systems consolidated at the same time. The other 2 feasibility studies were met with hostility. There was a lot of territorial independence. We don't want you taking over. We don't want to share our water. We don't want their bad water. It was just, the county just dropped it. It was met with such hostility. After the Valley Fire, 8 public water systems were destroyed. One of them that we managed started out with 151 customers. At the end of the fire, we had 14 homes left, and the water system was gone. The whole pump house, everything burned down. And we were scratching our head, how do you rebuild a water system with 14 customers? Those people wanted to come back home. They'd been in a shelter for weeks. We didn't have water. And the other neighboring water systems, same thing. What are we going to do? And the fire hadn't even been put out when we started talking about consolidation. It's the only way to get through this, and we did. 9 water systems in the Cobb Area Mountain were consolidated with a lot of help from State Water Resources Control Board, RCAC. We had so many people helping us. And I want to echo what Michael Thompson said about our regulators. We share the same regulators they do from State Water Resource Control Board. They are our partners, and I can't say enough about what those people do to help us. They really held hands and got us through this, because we were all suffering PTSD on top of our disaster. So that was a success. That is now a nice, big, strong, and homes are being rebuilt. They're able to meet building codes. But the climate has changed in the county. These little neighboring systems, little tiny ones that were so hostile at the very thought of consolidation, have realized if their water system and their home burns down, they can't rebuild. They don't have reserves. They haven't been planning for these kind of disasters, and they don't have the managerial and the technical financial to make a comeback, and they see that. And now they are having meetings. There's quite a few meetings around the county of different water systems that want to get together. And one of the biggest issues is, of all these little systems, trying to identify one that has the managerial capabilities of, it's a lot of work to consolidate. It is so much work, and you need one agency that's big enough and strong enough to really get in there and do it. But we are taking advantage of this new mindset. 2 years ago, I told my staff, we have a little window. People forget. While people are open-minded, let's make things happen. Well, Mother Nature hasn't let anybody forget. It's been one disaster after another, and nobody's ever forgetting. It's just getting stronger and stronger that, yes, we must get that economies of scale. We must share resources. The consolidation that took place in 1990, North Lake Port Water, not only survived the latest, we had our entire county was shut down from power for 7 days. And I mean everything. Sewer treatment plants, jails, the hospitals, the entire county shut down. And that that water system that consolidated in 1990 was able to provide water to some of the little systems whose generators burned up, because generators are not meant to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 7 days. They started burning up and blowing, and it turned into another emergency for us, because when your entire infrastructure is down. Another good thing that came of these disasters is everybody woke up to the importance of infrastructure. In the past, it was underground, out of sight. When you talk to people, ratepayers, about you wanted to implement a capital improvement fee, that was not a popular subject. They swore you just wanted to create a savings account that would disappear. It was met with such, now they understand that the ability to rebuild after a disaster, and everybody's convinced it's a matter of when, not if, in Lake County, a disaster will hit. You need to have some money set aside. Infrastructure, even from high up county levels. If you don't have proper infrastructure and a disaster hits and people can't meet building codes because maybe your water system doesn't allow for indoor sprinklers, maybe your sewer system doesn't allow, you can't get permits these days like they could 50 years ago. Well, the whole county suffers. Your schools lose students, you lose property taxes, people move away. People's homes, if their land is worth nothing because they can't build on it, they truly have lost everything. And I think it woke everybody up to so many things that right now, consolidation is the big push in Lake County, and we are working closely with RCAC, State Water Resources Control Board. Meetings are being held just as recently as a couple weeks ago before the power went out. I think it was 8 water systems want to get together and join. And it is our only way of bouncing back from a disaster, because that's what people need to think about, is not how you're going to get through it. It's if it devastates you, how are you going to bounce back? Because if you can't bounce back, you're lost. You just.
Thank you, Jan. We're going to go across the state to another region. Stephanie, you work in the San Joaquin Valley, which is a hotspot for safe drinking water crisis. This region, as Jonathan's pointed out, is also ground zero for the implementation of Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which seeks to address decades of groundwater overpumping. One criticism that we've heard of this process is that it often does not involve the very people that will be regulated under it, and especially small disadvantaged communities whose drinking water supply will be affected. So can you tell us a bit about Madera County and how you're working to increase participation of rural communities in this process?
Sure. So one thing our board does is we take our Board of Supervisors meetings on the road. So rather than meeting at 10 o'clock in the county government center, we will meet at 5 o'clock at night and go to Fairmead, or we're in Madera Ranchos tonight at 5 o'clock, Chowchilla, Oakhurst. We have a very big county. We're very diverse in terms of our geography, going way up into the Sierras. So we'll actually take the Board of Supervisors meetings on the road. And the county GSA does meet during those meetings.
And the GSA is Groundwater Sustainability Agency.
That's right. The county, under SGMA, counties are responsible for areas that were essentially undistricted or not represented by water agencies. So we have 225,000 acres within Madera County that the county itself represents as a GSA. So we've been following some best practices from places like Community Water Center and Self-Help and Leadership Council. We've tried meetings with food. We've tried different time of day meetings. The 4 to 6 seems to be the most popular in Madera County. We've offered translations if people need that during some of our SGMA meetings. That said, we still struggle with participation and numbers. And so what I've come to terms with is that rather than thinking of it as one table where we all have to sit around at the same exact time, there may be multiple tables, right? We may have a county GSA that meets at night some of the time, or at 10 o'clock in the morning some of the time. We will go to communities. We'll talk to Fairmead and Friends, a community organization. We'll go to La Viña, we'll go up to Indian Lakes in the foothills. These are all disadvantaged communities, and they have their own meetings, and we'll go to them and talk about SGMA.
Can you tell us a bit of what's at stake for these communities in your groundwater sustainability plan?
So for disadvantaged communities, the biggest concern that we've heard is about domestic wells. So these are people, and it's one household, and they have their own well. The well may or may not have gone dry during a drought. It may be okay now, but during a drought that's coming, it may go dry again. So their concerns are about their personal water supply.
Thank you, Stephanie. Darrin, I'm coming back to you. Let's say we meet on the stage in 5 years. What will be the biggest accomplishment in safe drinking water world that you will talk about at that point?
I'm actually going to take the liberty to say there's 2 items. I hope we're talking about how we took the state from 7,439 water systems to somewhere south of 5,000, and that we're shrinking even farther past that. And those of you that have seen me give speeches before, I often cite Kentucky. Yes, that Kentucky I'm modeling after. They went from 2,500 water systems to 400. Now, they took decades to do that, and it'll take us a long time to do that as well. So if Kentucky can do it, I damn sure know California can address it in that same fashion as well, right? Thank you. The other thing I hope we're talking about is that we're almost to zero on the water systems that are not meeting water quality standards, and that now we're talking about my high-risk list that's going to come out of the needs study. Those are the systems that are on the verge of ending up as not meeting water quality standards, and that we're actually able to start to turn our focus to those, and how do we prevent that so that I'm not forever chasing those that are on the violation list. A lot of times, I just kind of for interest, right now we have 300, and a lot of people see that number and they're like, oh, you just got 300 to work on. Well, if you look at how much we take on and off of that list in an average time year, about 60 water systems come off of that list, and about 50 to 60 get added to it. Mm-hmm. So it's not that there's just 300 systems. There's literally 1,000 of them lurking out there, and when we address one, we get the other one popping up. So we need to transition our thinking to not waiting until they get there, but to being ahead of the curve and making sure that we're addressing them before that. And it's a date. I'll be back in 5 years. That's great.
Thank you. Jonathan, imagine you're sitting right next to Darrin Polhemus, and he would like some advice. Are there 1 or 2 top-of-mind priorities you're hearing from impacted communities that the board should keep in mind as it implements the Safe Drinking Water Fund?
Yeah, well, hopefully in 5 years we will have gotten Darrin a lot of staff, and he'll be getting enough sleep at night and on the weekends. No. I think that we, in 5 years, want to see California be a state where every child here in California has safe drinking water in their home. And that the way we do that will be through multiple different strategies, but that's the vision we want to work towards, and ideally as quickly as we can. And that there's going to be sort of a set of solutions that are more short-term or interim about how are we making sure that schools that need bottled water can get it? How do we make sure that communities that right now don't have safe water can get some short-term, interim solutions in place so that they can have safe water, but to do that in a way that's integrated into a longer-term vision of making sure there are truly sustainable and resilient drinking water infrastructure and solutions for everyone in this state, and not just contingent on where you might happen to live. And I think that from the community standpoint, again, no one feels more investment or urgency to see solutions move forward, but that part of how we get to good outcomes is through process and being able to go to where communities are and to be able to engage with them as partners and to respect each other is how we'll be able to see solutions come together in alignment with both sort of the urgency that we need to see, but also with an eye towards truly resilient, sustainable solutions. And so I think, again, we are committed to doing our part. I will say that one place, again, that we see as a potential threat is how do we make sure that we're not implementing these big pieces of drinking water policy or water policy more broadly in a way that's segmented and siloed. So if we have entire domestic well communities that may run out of water under scenarios being put forward by certain groundwater sustainability agencies, that's going to be a problem for achieving the vision of the Drinking Water Fund of getting safe drinking water to all communities that need it. So how do we, again, create sort of a common table? I don't know if that's at the governor's office, at the legislature, at the California Environmental Protection Agency, at Natural Resources, but how are we making sure that these big pieces of public policy are being implemented in a way that reflects the intersectionality of people's lives on the ground?
Thank you. Jan, you also get to share advice with Darrin. So based on the Lake County experience, are there any priorities you think the board should keep in mind?
Assistance for these small systems, and I'll describe the typical Lake County small system. It might have been built 50 years ago. The same man that built it is still running it, but now he's 80 or something, and he doesn't have anybody that's interested in learning it, and he's having a real hard time keeping up with regulations that are changing, water quality that's changing. Those are very common things that I hear from small water systems, and it's going to be a crisis. I mean, we're at a crisis, but it's going to start, those dominoes are going to start falling real soon. And they don't know where to start. They don't have the funds. They've never thought about capital improvement reserves. They just survived. That's what they did. And I would like to see some kind of assistance, and I don't know what form that would come in, to help these people in that situation. And I believe we have, maybe 50, 60 water systems in that situation in Lake County. Listening to them, I go to the meetings for those that want to consolidate, because if no one else is there that wants to take them on, we, the county, would and be more than happy to, but we don't want it to look like we're trying to drum up business. That's not what we're doing. But I do think they need that hand-holding. It is basically what it is, and they need managerial, technical, and financial assistance to even figure out how to make a plan, because right now they don't know.
Thank you. Stephanie, I'm sorry, but you don't get to share advice with Darrin, and I'm actually taking you to even the more stressful place. We're going to meet on this stage 5 years from now, and you're going to be in the middle of updating your groundwater sustainability plan. So what will be one accomplishment that Madera County has made towards safe drinking water access that you will talk about?
So right now, we're applying for a grant that will allow us to inventory domestic wells. Like many counties, our records are good recently, and they're not so good as we go further back in time. So we do not have the robust inventory of all domestic wells in Madera County that we need. And we need that in order to figure out how we can mitigate. The second thing is I think we need to have a countywide feasibility analysis of where we can connect people who are on domestic wells to existing systems. So this is a form of consolidation, but it would be one person at a time. This would need a source of funding. The county can't fund that on its own. Many people think, because they pay property taxes, that that is what counties live on and that there's a giant pile of gold in the center of the county. That's not actually the case. The 75% of county budget is non-discretionary. We are the people who do the work for federal and state programs. Your property taxes are a very small part of the budget, and even that part, about 70%, is going to sheriff and fire. So we do not have the money to connect, and it would be a gift of public funds if we were to connect people to systems, but we need help with that.
All right, thank you. Thank you all. So I'm going to ask one last question. This is our lightning round, so you have 30 seconds to answer. If you could add one priority to Governor's water resilience portfolio, what would it be? I'm going to start with you, Darrin.
Oh, wow. Well, switching hats from the small water systems to the large ones, we need to continue to invest in our water recycling and direct potable reuse that we're working on regulations for now, and bring that in as another one of our portfolios for how we're going to address our water future.
I think we would want to see both a statement around what are the common California values we want to put forward. Should be no them and us. We're one California community. And that there also needs to be some discussion about how are we, again, integrating these big pieces of water policy like the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund in a way that positions both of them to be able to be implemented successfully.
I would want to remind them that cookie cutters won't work, that the differences between the small water systems and the urban suppliers are vastly different, and that needs to be recognized because one size fits all just won't work in water management.
So I would point to taking a hard look at financing. We basically have two ways we can raise funds for projects, including domestic well mitigation under SGMA. We can go after a grant, in which case it could take 6 to 12 months to even execute the grant if awarded, and a couple of years to actually pay. So grants are great, but they are a slow-moving mechanism. Our other choice is to go through a 218 proceeding, which is extraordinarily painful in our part of the state. We have folks who don't necessarily like or trust government, and the gut response is, so you're asking if I want to pay more in taxes? No, right?
All right, thank you all very much. We're going to open this up to the questions from audience. A few of my colleagues from PPIC are walking around with microphones, so wait till you get approached. Okay, I see somebody over there.
Oh, hi. Yes, if you combine the fracking into the water tables and toxifying already impoverished communities, along with the degradation of drinking water quality by the oil industry and big agriculture dumping pesticides and nitrogenous fertilizers into this water supply, and then add to that the confiscation and expropriation of water resources by big ag, where else will the small districts go? They're confronting this is the little guy confronting Goliath.
I guess I'll field that one. That's a really easy question. Yeah. So I guess I kind of hinted at this. I mean, our water quality's changed undoubtedly for many reasons in many locations. And I think we have to adjust to the reality that a lot of drinking water is going to need treatment. You're not going to be able to drop a well into a sweet aquifer and just pay the electric bill for the next 50 years. We also are learning a lot more about what is toxic to us. People often complain that I impose new regulations on them. Of course, the flip side of that is I could just say, well, we'll continue to let that affect our health, and of course, that's not the right answer either. So it is a new reality. It is going to cost us all more. Unfortunately, we're just going to have to realize that it's probably worth paying for it, that drinking water is necessary, and that those costs have to be factored into how we're going to approach kind of the new future going forward and invest in the resiliency that I heard talked about before as well.
Thanks. Next question.
Darrin, Frank Ramirez, National Director of Government Affairs for National American Indians. Question regarding the small districts. They don't have the same requirements, regulations, and a place like Arvin, California, small community, but they have several small water districts, so they're exempt from the regulations. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about the state smalls. Those are water systems that are from 5 to 14 connections. And yeah, state law right now really gives them a pass on what they're required to test for. That's an open question. I think we're open for a discussion about and how do we deal with that. And I think that drops down the same to private domestic wells. We don't do a good job, and we're working at it now. Part of what we're going to do with the Safe Drinking Water Funds is start to publish some high-risk maps that are going to, for the first time, probably let some people know that they're pulling from aquifers that are already known to be contaminated and they need to test their well. That's probably a shocker to some of you, but I would venture to say most private domestic well owners haven't tested their well in a long time, maybe ever, since they've owned the house, and could be actually drinking water that doesn't meet water quality standards. So it's a very open question. We need to work more in that space. We need to look at that. Part of my hope is to do what Jonathan talked about and looking at clusters of private domestic wells that are in areas that we can actually bring in a water utility for them and address both that and then the state smalls as well to try to get them hooked up where we can. And then there's going to be a bunch of them that are stranded, and we're going to have to deal with that question. And I don't have perfect answers. Kind of each one's an answer in itself.
Can I just quickly chime in on that? And thank you for the question. Those communities are top of mind for the environmental justice organizations that work on safe water because they are hardest to reach and the solution set is difficult. We found, like was mentioned, that many of these systems haven't tested, if they've tested at all, for common contaminants in years, if not decades. And that's a problem in the Central Valley, in the Central Coast, in the northern part of the state. So we really want to make sure that those communities' needs are being prioritized as part of implementation of the Drinking Water Fund, and that those conversations, are starting now.
Thanks. Let's see. Next question over there in the back.
So, sorry. So the title of this panel was Next Steps, and I'm wondering if any of you, I guess this would be mainly for you, Darrin, but could concretely address, now that we have this fund, the great victory we're celebrating, but so far a lot of what you've talked about is actually finding more problems by testing and so forth. And the example of Lanier that was brought up in the beginning seems to be a sort of major obstacle in terms of a long-term sustainability of providing safe drinking water in a way that's financially sustainable. What exactly are the next steps that are going to happen now that this fund does exist, presumably over 10 years?
Yeah, so we're working to communicate that even better. So definitely stay tuned for more and more details about it. But so we had some tools that we already had. We have mandatory consolidation. We have the ability to help with voluntary consolidations. And by the way, we do 4 times more voluntary ones than we do mandatory. It was always just meant to be a good, credible threat that you could either do it on your terms or you can do it on mine, and I'd rather you not do it on mine. We have now the ability with the fund to fund the administrators, so we had that ability given to us a couple years ago, and now we can use, we had no funding for it, so we had only ever done one down in Southern California, and now we can broadly do that. And I think that's probably one of the biggest, most venturous steps we're taking. So an administrator, in essence, is when we can step in and both either in a friendly terms or mandatory require someone to take over operation of a small water system that's failing and meets the criteria that's in the law. so that we can actually get them that help. I'm thinking a lot of them are going to just invite us in. They're the ones that are struggling, know they're struggling, need the help, and it's like, yes, I'll take a professional person to come here and write the grants, applications, do the construction management, hire the contractors, bring on the accountants, and then maybe also negotiate with the neighboring water systems, even if it's not going to be a physical connection, but a managerial joining. Because, the studies I saw said that right off the top, small water systems pay 12% more for the same thing big water systems buy. That's just materials. And then you throw on top of that, their inability or their inefficiency in their administration. They're already behind the 8 ball. You give them poor water quality. They don't have a reserve fund. We have to change this whole paradigm. So the really big thing is trying to change that thinking through some of these tools we have. We have technical assistance that we've done before. That's going to go even farther. We're going to do some more exploratory attempts to actually have where we hire stuff ahead of time and then can deliver it so that they don't have to go through the hiring process. So we're trying to shortcut a lot of the deficiencies that were there in the funding programs we had before, in that, they required us to give a grant to a legal entity. The legal entity had to manage it, account for it, survive the audit afterwards, and do all of that work. And that works with big water systems that have the infrastructure. Small ones simply don't have that base to do that.
Thank you. Next question. Over here.
Yeah, I don't want this to be the Darrin Pinata phase of the program.
I'm used to it. Go ahead. Bring it on.
I thought so. The last couple of years, the discussion that led to successful legislation really drew attention to a lot of what I would call classic contaminants, arsenic and nitrates and stuff like that. There's this growing national and California attention, maybe almost at a panic level, to the PFAS family of contaminants that are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. Where do you see the state headed? This is both a large system and small system kind of issue. Where's the state headed on this?
Yeah, good question. So I last week was at the national meeting of all the state water administrators, so my counterparts in the other states. And so we're not alone in this, and we're actually probably not the worst off either in the grand scheme of things compared to some of the states where these materials are manufactured and have been even further spread throughout their environment and contaminated their water sources. So it's an evolving area. The health components on it that we know so far, and I will just caveat that it's not studied to a complete extent yet, but they all pretty much scare me about how toxic this is. I hear people talk about, well, we're in parts per trillion, and all you've done is able to detect it at this really small levels. And actually, I think a couple weeks ago at the Aqua PFAS Summit, there was some great presentations from Marty Melanie and others that talk about how the human body actually hangs on to PFAS materials, some of them, much longer than we can even have a biological explanation for, even more than some other primates when they're doing the testing. So humans seem to have found a unique poison for themselves in this regard and released it into the environment. So it is in parts of the state. We're continuing our investigation to see how far it needs to go, but it is, in my mind, one of the things that lurks there as ultimately a lot of water systems, more than we have now and more than we're used to, we're going to need some form of treatment, even if it's passive carbon treatment or other things, to make full utilization of our water resources. I guess I'll sort of apologize for the human race, but we've been a pretty messy species, and we've caused these problems for ourselves. And I don't think we want to then turn away and not address the health impacts that those bring, and have to look at that in the light of this is where we have to go forward. We need to do it as a community, and there'll be a lot of more public discussion about this as we move forward with, what kind of regulatory level should be set. And, we've asked OEHA now to prepare a public health goal, so there'll be more information coming from that, and we just kind of have to sit by and continue to learn as we go along.
Thank you. We have our last question over here.
This is primarily for Darrin, but also for the other panelists. Many integrated plans have partnered with Prop 1 and Prop 84 over the years to leverage very strong stakeholder groups to focus efforts on helping disadvantaged communities and small water systems specifically. This has been very effective in some regions locally, and my question to all of you is, integrated planning is traditionally thought of as a DWR program. What is integrated planning's role and that stakeholder network that we've invested since the early 2000s of building? How does it fit into the Safe Drinking Water Fund? Is there a role for integrated planning in those stakeholder groups, and if so, how?
Yeah, so I guess from my standpoint, yes, it does have a role. I think we want to, even fashion it in a more direct line to, So let me stop for a second and kind of go the other way. I encourage the large water systems that I deal with all the time to look beyond their borders. And integrated planning and the stuff they've done is great work, and I want them to include their neighbors that aren't able to do that and bring them into the picture, because I think that's a necessary component. In the water industry, we all take a hit. Even if it's a small system that makes the paper, your customers are just as worried, about what that could mean for them later. Even if you tell them how wonderful you are and you are doing a great job, as a whole, we lose a little bit of faith each time one of those does. So I think it's important that those integrated plans continue to branch out, that there is a space for this to be included in that this can play a role and that we can leverage those things. As we all do, it is so hard to bring all these pieces together, and that's the same for us in the state as well. So we, rely on your help as outside partners to help us, accomplish those goals as well.
I just want to chime in that I think the environmental justice community, sees both a concern and an opportunity, not just, but thinking about sort of our planning spaces even more broadly, and this goes again back to Sigma, but others, that many times there's sort of just a seat for the environmental justice community or a seat for impacted residents in these spaces. And that's important to have that seat, but then what about the representation of that planning space overall? And if you have if the representation is broadly skewed or almost entirely skewed, like we see in many groundwater sustainability agencies, towards being almost entirely landowners or other sort of larger interests, and then you've got one seat for environmental justice representatives or smaller impacted communities, then that's going to manifest in the outcomes or the products of those spaces. So we really want to see continued conversation about the representation in those planning spaces. When we have good representation, we get really good outcomes. And so I think that's the opportunity and the spirit that we want to bring into the Drinking Water Fund implementation.
Okay, that's a great, Stephanie, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to echo that. In Madera County, the IRWIM group is really the only place where everybody is around the same table at the same time. So I think it's a very useful tool in this process.
That's a great last point to end on. Please join me in giving a hand to our panel.